Today I want to talk about an article by Roy Scranton that was published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. It's called No Happy Ending, on Bill McKibben's Falter and David Wallace-Wells' The Uninhabitable Earth. So I'm going to read a few quotes, and towards the end here I have some comments that I'm going to make, but I want to give you guys the quick and dirty, I guess, summary of what this article's after. So I'm going to spoil it. I'm going to read a quote from the very end of the article. So, despite the unconvincing cheer for human empowerment with which he ends his book, David Wallace-Wells understands the seriousness of our predicament. And, despite his atavistic Protestant optimism, even Bill McKibben can see that the odds are not in our favor. The challenge these two capable, intelligent writers struggle with so powerfully, and which they so disappointingly fail to meet, is a challenge that anyone who thinks seriously about climate change confronts. The danger we face is utterly unlike anything humanity has ever faced before. Their moral fables don't really fit our situation, but neither does the traditional narrative of apocalypse, nor the story of wartime mobilization, nor the story of innovation and progress, nor narratives of heroic overcoming. So, the main thrust of his article is he analyzes these two books and comes to the conclusion that even if we were able to do something about climate change, we often talk about that as though the main barrier to doing it is choosing to do it. It's an issue of our will, and he's very, very set on pointing out that the real challenge is logistically actually getting the thing done once we've decided to do it. And that's a facet of the problem that is under-discussed. So he starts his article with this really nice analogy to being a phone psychic, and he talks about the precept that they use is, how does he put it? You tell them things will be hard, and then you tell them things will get better if they work at it. And he uses that framework to basically imply that these two authors, as well as I assume the implication is that apocalyptic fiction, eco-apocalyptic fiction in general, and probably other genres are guilty of this problem. So he leaves the profession of being a psychic. He leaves it because of his morals. And then in this article, he's turning around and pointing out that McKibben and Wallace-Wells are still being naughty, and that they're just basically playing the role of the phone psychic and filling us with this empty hope that even if it does render us capable of ideologically moving for change, it does not in any way act as a predictor that we could enact that change in the real world. So, as I said, his primary foe in the piece are actually the stories themselves. So the stories that we could tell all have happy endings, or in his case, as a psychic, and then the implication is with these books that all the stories that one ought to tell or that one can tell necessarily have to have happy endings. So here's what he says about McKibben's book. Climate change poses such profound challenges to the ways that we conceive of human existence that we are compelled to rethink what that existence means. In some sense, this was apparent from McKibben's first book, The End of Nature, published in 1989. Since then, he's been a leading voice in framing the problems climate change poses. Yet his solutions lean always toward the homiletic, so the religious sermon. The story McKibben knows best is one in which our mission in the wilderness has foundered, but can be saved by spiritual renewal. When he turns to face the future, he does so dressed in a faded patchwork of Protestant confessionalism, Disney-fied romanticism, and faith in human redemption. That's pretty spicy. It's a pretty well-crafted attack. Full disclosure, I haven't had the chance to read both of these books. They're rather long, and speaking frankly, there are other much better equipped people who are much further into the reading of this type of fiction and theory, commentary, whatever, than I am. The main reason that I wanted to talk about this article will become apparent later. I want to talk more about the generalized idea of climate change, not necessarily the academic interpretation of these two books. But let me forge ahead. So his criticism of McKibben's book is that in the last chapters, he turns to basically a straw man issue where he brings up this guy, it's a guy named Guy, McPherson, who is a professor at, I think, Arizona U or some other such. Don't quote me on the institution. But he's a real scholar, and he thinks that humans are going to be extinct by 2030. Like full extinction. There's even a term for it. It's called near-term human extinction. That's his baby idea. And that's a fringe idea, certainly. And maybe it's one that is worth ridicule. I don't know if we're a decade from full extinction. But anyway, the problem is that the reader and the story seems to extrapolate from that the following issue. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is in response to Wallace-Wells, not McKibben. So he's moved on to Wallace-Wells. So Wallace-Wells seems to have decided that anyone who takes seriously the possibility that climate change has slipped out of our control isn't worth seriously considering. It's not a great loss with McPherson, but it is disappointing to see Wallace-Wells treat Paul Kingsnorth, a provocative and original writer, with condescension and misunderstanding. While McPherson believes he can tell the future, Kingsnorth's pessimism is grounded in the past, founded on a simple fact which any historian could confirm. Human civilization is an intensely fragile construction built on little more than belief. I think that's spot on. And then he says, here's the crux. Climate change is our choice, for we have all the tools we need to stop it. The solution Wallace-Wells offers are familiar ones. The solutions he offers are familiar ones. Carbon tax, investment in green energy, carbon capture, changing the ways we produce and eat food. But he doesn't spend much time thinking about the practical steps such policies would require. And here we're getting into that main point that I mentioned earlier, where it's the logistics that are his main stumbling block. He doesn't think much about how politics and government work. He doesn't look at history to see how humans in crisis have handled such challenges before. He doesn't even follow through the implications of everything he's written in the rest of his book. In spite of his own evidence, Wallace-Wells ends on a note of hope, choosing to see climate change as an invigorating picture that flatters our sense of power and in so doing calls the world to action. Wallace-Wells' personal exhortations that we choose to feel empowered and take responsibility for climate change ring as hollow as the self-help slogans they so resemble. Another great line, a very cutting attack. And so he does a fairly good job, I think, of showing how both authors fall into this fallacy of if we were just better, then it would be a corollary effect where our hard work would result in a good outcome, a hopeful outcome to the story of humans versus environment. And so, unluckily for us, he says, climate change is not a moral fable, a point Wallace makes, but then seems to forget. There's nothing to learn from global warming, he writes early on, because we do not have the time or the distance to contemplate its lessons. We are, after all, not merely telling the story, but living it, and therein lies the problem with both books. The story we're living in is one of failure, catastrophe, suffering, and tragedy, an out-of-control car careening off a dark road. The story Wallace-Wells and McKibben wind up telling, however, is that we're in control of the skid, and the skid is manageable, rather. If only we choose to take the wheel, it's a story I've heard before. So, and then the article ends on this pessimistic note where he's saying we have to accept that there's a pretty good likelihood that the story of humanity is one that ends in abject tragedy. And so now I have some of my own responses here that I'll read off, and then I'm hoping that you and I can have a little back and forth on the topic. So for me, our story has been a tragedy from the beginning, whether it's overpopulation, nuclear annihilation, pollution, global warming, asteroid, the Andromeda galaxy, the heat death of the universe, the death of the sun. We're not going to get out either way. Like, eventually there's going to come a point where What does Camelot say? In a heartbeat, only silence. Eventually it's done, and the only thing that we can discuss is what do we do until then. And for me, the questions that are really important, it doesn't actually matter if we go extinct by 2030 or 5 trillion years from now. The things that I care about deeply remain the same. Let me explain what I mean by that. It matters to me how we die. Even if I accept, which I do, the idea that Scranton is putting forward here, that it's pretty likely that we're doomed and that we've fucked up the planet potentially irreversibly. But that's still, how many more animals are we going to slaughter before that time? And I don't mean slaughter for food. Let's not even get into the debate of whether it's good or bad to eat meat. Let's talk purely about the mechanized factory farming that we do. How many more animals are going to die before we decide that that's a bad policy? And how likely is it that that policy will continue if we uptake the idea that there's not even going to be anybody to sort of judge our crimes? What does it matter if you're on the wrong side of history if no history is going to be written? And I realize that verges a little bit close to the well, if there's no religion, then how do you get morals? There's some parallels there to what I just said, but I think there's enough of a distinction that it's a point that's worth making and discussing. So and what kind of planet are we going to leave? So we could leave a place where there's no life, and the Earth could be damaged enough that the cycle might take millions of years to repeat itself. Or we could destroy the planet and cause a runaway effect so profound that the planet turns into a Mars-like desert where there's nothing alive. And so for me, there's a distinction between wiping ourselves out and potentially wiping out even the idea of consciousness, so far as we know it. There isn't anywhere else where this little experiment is going on that we can observe. And so, assuming, based on available evidence, that there's not anybody else that we're going to be able to interact with, from our perspective, if we fuck up the planet to the point where no life can ever live, then we may have extinguished the only statistical existence of life that there's ever going to be in the current, form that the universe takes. So, and then there's the issue of, I think, egalitarianism, which is to say, for me, the issue is not just that we save the planet. It's whether we live for 10 more years or 20 or 50 or 200. I want those years to be years in which the least amount of people suffer and die in abject poverty, and the least possible number of people die without basic fundamental human rights. And so then, at the risk of being long-winded, so I'm open to tragedy, but I suppose my final heroic hope is that we could be something like the villain that turns its sword aside at the last moment as he's rushing an enemy at the edge of a cliff. And even though in this analogy we're going to still go over the side and die, that doesn't mean that we have to take everything else with us. And there can be an acceptance that we deserve to die, and still protect Earth, Gaia, whatever you want to call it. I think there's the opportunity for us to make the last thing that we do matter, in the sense that perhaps we can't save ourselves, but maybe there's something that we could do to make it so 1,000,000 years from now something else might be able to live. And so now I'll turn it over to you. I thought the article was intensely thought-provoking, well-written. I generally agree with everything that's in there, with the caveat that I haven't read the 2 books that are being critiqued. But overall, for me, it was a great article, and one that's pointing out a real thing, a real problem with the structure and timbre of the narratives that have become popular in dealing with climate change and addressing that issue. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, would that I could have spent more time with the article or the books. Sorry, I was just looking at my notes here. I have to say for myself, at least, that I think tragedy, as he puts it, is likely, and that, how does he say? We're living in a tragedy that ends in disaster. I think that's likely, unfortunately. But I may not have hope for the individual. I love science fiction. I love literature of the fantastic and fantasy and all that. I have to have hope that maybe as a race someday we could leave the planet, explore the galaxy, do all these great fantastical things. And so with that hope that I hold on to so dearly, I'd like to think there's something we can do. Even if factually it all just ends in the next 10 years and we all die. I do agree that what we do between now and then still matters. The way you put it one time that I really liked, because we've talked about this before in the past, this idea that, even if nihilism is the case, even if nothing matters in the end of cosmic time, I still think that as long as there is time, as long as the music of the universe plays, I'd like to know that my existence might have colored the tone of that music, as I think you put it. I'd like to know that at the end, it wasn't all useless, even if it comes to nothing. That when we die, when the race dies, we leave something behind that can support life again, that can come back and replenish and move forward. Another way I've always put it is, if I know the only way to success or the only possible victory is behind an impenetrable door, I'm still just going to bang on the door. Even if there's no hope, even if I don't succeed, even if I die, it's still worth the effort of having tried to get in to gain the victory. And maybe that's a little binary, maybe a little too, black and white. I think it matters that we were here. I think it matters that we exist. I think it matters that what we use the remaining time with, if that's what it is, we have to do something. I've never bought into this idea of, I remember, I think it was actually Arnold Schwarzenegger that I was like, really, I can't believe he was saying this. Even if you just don't buy climate change, we can demonstrably show that the things that we're doing are negative to ourselves right now. We know just pumping chemicals into the air is bad. We need to do something.
Yeah, we know air quality is shittier even in the United States. But, I mean, there's lots of places. I don't want to send us on a tangent, but, I mean, you don't need to look any further than some of the cities in China and parts of the Middle East. And I think India has some cities that are really bad where you wear gas masks and shit because of the pollution. It's not because of something that naturally occurs. They ruined the air with the factories, and I know global rates for asthma are way up. We could talk that into the ground.
I guess the general point was in the long term, if we know, we're going to die, that still doesn't matter to me, because I know in the short term there's things we can do that will improve our lives today.
That's a critique that I think I would level at the article is, and it's a trend that I have seen. A book that comes to mind that we read in a graduate class that was towards the end, so just like this last year, was Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm blanking on the title of the book. It doesn't matter. He frames it as the dream in his book, but it's the similar type of. He's very good at pointing out that certain types of hope or certain types of positive narrative are sort of self-defeating. But he doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of solutions or action-based language that I think is necessary in these times, and I think the same thing is true of Scranton here. He does a pretty good job of pointing out that, climate change is probably worse than even some of our writers who do have their finger on the pulse to some degree. It's even worse than they are letting on, and that even they are trapped in some narratives of rebirth and overcoming. That's all great, but what now? Does he think by writing the article that disseminating that, like pointing out the flaw, is that all that he's responsible for doing? Has he done his job now, or
Yeah,
am I completely just floundering here?
No, I agreed. I was thinking about it. I come back to this quote at the beginning. It says, "The power of institutional inertia and the dangers of finding yourself trapped in the wrong story." I think, he may be guilty of his own sin here, and that, even if we know the story has a bad ending, it doesn't matter. Like, I keep coming back to that, where I don't think his job is done here. I don't think this article is sufficient enough, because you're just giving yourself over to the institutional inertia. You're just laying down in front of the train and waiting, and that's just dumb. No matter the end, and no matter the outcome.
I don't know if I agree with everything you just said, but I did leave the article going, okay, I buy that some of the narratives that we have are too positive in a certain way that could lead to either inaction or slow action, or a failure to comprehend the gravity, the level to which we are fucked. But I also came away wanting to know, what's he going to be doing then for the next couple years? Is he advocating that we should just try and enjoy it while it lasts? Or what? I felt like it left me a little bit hollow in terms of, like, surely there are gradations that matter. Like, how bad is it going to get in the Middle East and Africa in the next 10 to 15 years before we take radical action? Even if it means that in the end we're all pooled into, like, the north of the tropics and in a couple places where we have to continually keep cramming people in and the food is failing. Like, that's going to happen potentially. But doesn't it matter how we approach that disaster? Or something I put in my notes that I didn't read through at the time was, isn't it more important now than ever that we fast track egalitarianism? Don't we want as many highly educated women from the Middle East as we can possibly get right now? Like, we need them right now, today. Every single person who's smart enough to come up with a fucking idea, like, we need them right now. And half of the world is still oppressing women. So doesn't that mean that the fight for feminism in the next 5 to 10 years, it's more profound, more meaningful, more important than it could have ever been? Because every moment that we waste not fighting for those rights is a moment that we are continuing to careen towards ecological collapse, and simultaneously decreasing the number of able-bodied intellectuals to fight that battle. And I don't know if that's a way of thinking that Scranton is contending with, to my satisfaction here. And this criticism has been leveled at me many times. In fact, the professor that tweeted out this article in the first place, he was pretty fond of saying that my weakness is that I'm really good at pointing out other people's flawed arguments, but not so good at offering my own evidence or solutions. And I would argue that in this case, like knows like, and I think Scranton is a writer much after my own heart, but also it seems like maybe he has made some of the same mistakes that I have made as an intellectual, in that he points out the problem very good, but does at the very least, he doesn't address coming up with solutions. But at worst, he is neglectful of the need for solutions.
Yeah, this did a very good job overall, in the sense of, as far as the two books are concerned, I think he handles them quite well. I think, he does point out some of the positives. He does talk about their general overall thrust and some of the things you can find if you choose to seek them out. But definitively, he does not go further than that, other than to say, like, you both get it wrong, everything's fucked. Period.
Well, he does mention that, short of trillions of dollars worth of air purifying equipment things, carbon collectors, whatever you want to call it, short of that, he says we're probably fucked.
Yeah. And he had a quote, I don't think I actually wrote it down, is what I was looking for. So to quote Mr. Scranton here, he did say something to the effect of, it'll probably require massive revolution and social upheaval. And I think that's probably true, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the last point that I want us to touch on, is that he makes the criticism that effectively peaceful protest isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I'm a radical leftist, so I also... He doesn't come out and say it in this article, I think probably for obvious reasons, but I support violent overthrow of the state. And I think that's one way that we can accomplish some of those goals. And I think that more and more people are starting to realize that the traditional mechanisms that we have for enacting change are not going to work, because this is the exceptional situation to rule all exceptional situations. It's time for us to do some crazy shit. That's why I was advocating for Mike Gravel, the guy who is running for the Democratic Party, who is going to try and get a constitutional amendment into the discourse where the people could enact their own laws and vote them into legislation and stuff like that. I agree with Scranton that radical change is going to be the only truly effective method to combat this issue, but we should still be trying all the other stuff, even if it's slower. I was just about to say,
you know me, my favorite quote, despite the dubiousness of the source, is Bill Nye says everyone should do everything all the time, as much as you can, or something to that effect.
Yeah,
and I like that idea. Regardless of the source, I like this, that these other institutional changes are needed, as you pointed out, but there's so much that everyone can be doing.
Yeah, so great article by Roy Scranton, and I hope to see more things like this being published.